The first thing I tasted wasn't the metallic tang of blood or the salt of the Atlantic wind. It was 91-octane gasoline. It hung in the air of the Pier 34 warehouse like a physical weight, thick enough to coat the back of my throat. My wrists were raw where the nylon zip ties bit into the skin, the plastic serrations digging deeper with every shallow, panicked breath I took. Above me, on the rusted iron catwalk, Julian Sterling stood with the casual grace of a man checking his reflection in a mirror. He held a red plastic jerry can, tilting it with a rhythmic, sickening glug glug glug. I watched the liquid amber stream hit the concrete floor 3 feet from my chair, splashing against my designer heels. The fumes were so potent they made the edges of my vision fray into a dull, pulsing gray. "You have to understand the mathematics of it, Elena," Julian said, his voice echoing off the corrugated iron walls with a terrifying clarity. He sounded like he was presenting a quarterly earnings report. "The Sterling Trust is hemorrhaging. My grandfather's forensic auditors are 3 days away from discovering the $20 million hole I carved out of the Vance accounts. If you're alive, I'm a thief. If you're a casualty of a tragic industrial accident, I'm the grieving fiancé and the primary beneficiary of your life insurance policy. It's not personal. It's a restructuring." Beside him, my sister Serena stepped into the light of the single flickering halogen bulb. She looked radiant, her blonde hair perfectly tousled in a way that screamed calculated distress. She was wearing my mother's sapphire locket, the one she had sworn was lost years ago. Her fingers traced the gold casing with a slow, possessive hunger. "Don't look at me like that, Elena," Serena purred, her voice a saccharine poison. "You were always that strong one. That smart one. The one who sacrificed everything to keep the Vance name afloat while I played the fragile socialite. Well, congratulations. You're finally making the ultimate sacrifice. Julian and I are going to take that insurance payout and build an empire that actually matters. You were just the bridge we had to cross to get there." I tried to scream, but the duct tape across my mouth turned the sound into a pathetic, muffled grunt. My heart hammered against my ribs, a trapped bird in a cage of bone, but a clinical, freezing detachment was already beginning to settle over my mind. I wasn't just watching my sister, I was auditing her soul. I saw the tremor in her hand, the frantic, high-pitched edge to her laughter. She wasn't just evil, she was desperate. Julian tossed the empty jerry can over the railing. It hit the floor with a hollow, plastic thud that sounded like a coffin lid closing. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver Zippo, the one I'd bought him for our 3rd anniversary, engraved with the words, "Forever yours." Clink. Flick. The small orange flame was a tiny sun in the cavernous dark. "The fire marshal will call it arson by a disgruntled third party," Julian noted, his eyes flat and devoid of any lingering affection. "Perhaps one of the Russian creditors your father owes. There will be no third-party liability for the Sterling Foundation. We've been very thorough with the paper trail." Serena leaned over the railing, a manic glint in her eyes. "Goodbye, Elena. Thanks for the trust fund." She dropped a lit match. The world didn't just catch fire, it exploded. The gasoline-soaked air ignited with a concussive whoosh that knocked the air from my lungs. The heat was instantaneous, a physical wall of white-hot agony that licked at the hem of my silk dress. The flames climbed the pillars, orange and predatory, turning the warehouse into a furnace. I watched them walk toward the exit, their shadows stretching long and grotesque against the fire. They didn't look back. They didn't hesitate. They left me in the center of the pyre they had built with my own money. The heat began to blister the skin on my arms. The smell of burning hair and melting synthetic fabric filled my nostrils. I felt the nylon ties on my wrists begin to soften, then fuse with my flesh. Pain was no longer a sensation, it was the only reality. My lungs felt like they were being filled with liquid lead as I inhaled the black, oily smoke. I closed my eyes. In that final, agonizing moment, I didn't pray for heaven. I didn't ask for a quick death. I reached into the void and made a pact with whatever darkness was listening. Give me back my life, and I will burn their world down to the bedrock. The floor gave way. I fell into a sea of white heat. A violent gasp of air ripped through my lungs, pulling me back from the black void. My eyes snapped open. I wasn't in a warehouse. I was sitting on a velvet chaise lounge. The air didn't smell of gasoline and ash, it smelled of expensive lemon polish and stale cigar smoke. My hands flew to my face, smooth skin. No blisters. No melting flesh. I looked down at my lap. I was wearing a pale blue silk dress. My favorite dress. The one I had worn on May 14th, 5 years ago. The day my father had summoned me to the Vance Manor study to tell me about the debt. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked with a heavy, mahogany cadence. Tick. 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 Each second was a hammer blow against the silence. I took a breath, a real, deep, cool breath, and felt a clinical, freezing calm wash over me. The girl who wanted her family's love had burned to ash in Brooklyn. The woman sitting here was something else entirely. The heavy mahogany doors swung open. Serena burst into the room, a flawless vision of calculated distress, her eyes already brimming with artificially induced tears. Elena. Oh, thank God you're here, she sobbed, rushing forward to grab my hands. Her touch, once comforting, now made my skin crawl with a visceral revulsion. It took every ounce of my willpower not to wrap my fingers around her throat and squeeze until the light left her eyes. It's father. His investments, they've failed. We owe $20 million, Elena. The creditor, he's a monster. He wants collateral. He wants me. Behind her, my father, Robert Vance, trudged into the room, his face pale and sweating. He couldn't even look at me. Julian and I were supposed to be married next month, Serena wailed, dropping to her knees and burying her face in my lap, exactly as she had done in the previous life. If I go to that man, Damien Sinclair, he'll ruin me. Elena, you're so strong. You've always been the brave one. Please, save us. I looked down at the top of her blonde head. I could see the exact spot where the sapphire locket would one day rest against her skin. I reached out and stroked her hair, my touch light, professional, and entirely devoid of warmth. Don't worry, Serena, I said, my voice a flat, melodic blade that cut through her fake hysterics. I won't let him ruin you. In fact, I'm going to make sure everyone gets exactly what they deserve this time. I stood up, forcing her to fall back onto the rug with an ungraceful yelp. I smoothed the front of my blue dress and turned toward my father. Where is Mr. Sinclair? I asked. I believe it's time we discussed the terms of my surrender. I walked toward the grand parlor, my heels clicking a rhythmic death toll on the hardwood. I knew that behind those doors sat the man the world called a monster, Damien Sinclair. In my past life, I had entered that room a trembling sacrifice. Today, I was entering as a predator who had already seen the end of the world. The hunt hadn't just begun, I was already 3 moves ahead. The hallway of Vance Manor was a gallery of fading glory. As I walked, I kept my spine perfectly vertical, my shoulders pinned back as if braced against a gale. The oil portraits of my ancestors seemed to track my movement with their painted eyes, generations of men who had built shipping empires only for my father to dissolve them in the backrooms of Atlantic City casinos. My heels, 4-inch Louboutins, struck the oak floorboards with a clinical, metronomic precision. Asterisk clack. Clack. Clack asterisk in my previous life, this walk had felt like a journey to the gallows. My knees had been water, my vision blurred by a veil of useless tears. But today, the adrenaline was cold, a glacial stream running through my veins. I wasn't a victim being led to slaughter, I was a forensic auditor coming to collect. I reached the double mahogany doors of the grand parlor. The air here was colder, stripped of the manor's central heating, smelling of damp stone and a sudden, sharp scent of expensive cedarwood and aged bourbon. I didn't knock. I placed my palms against the cold wood and pushed. The room was vast, dominated by a vaulted ceiling that swallowed the light. Damien Sinclair sat in a high-backed leather armchair near the unlit hearth. He didn't look up as I entered. He was staring into the cold ashes, swirling a glass of amber liquid in his right hand. Two massive men in dark suits stood by the exits, monoliths of muscle with eyes like motion sensors. I stopped exactly 3 feet from him. Damien was a mountain of a man, his charcoal bespoke suit straining against shoulders that seemed too broad for a boardroom. From the right, his profile was devastating, a razor-sharp jawline, an aristocratic nose, and thick, dark hair. Then, he turned his head. The light from the chandelier caught the left side of his face. The rumors hadn't done it justice. The acid had melted the skin from his cheekbone down to his collarbone, leaving a twisted landscape of rigid, angry red and pale pink scar tissue. His left eye was framed by skin pulled so tight it gave him a perpetual, menacing glare. Most people flinched. Most people vomited. In my first life, I had kept my eyes squeezed shut, trembling so hard I'd nearly collapsed. Today, I leaned in. I studied the texture of the scars, the way the light played off the ruined dermis. "You aren't the blonde," he said. His voice was a deep, rough baritone, like gravel grinding against steel. It vibrated in the center of my chest. "No, Mr. Sinclair," I replied. My voice was a flat, steady instrument. "I am Elena, the elder sister. My father's favorite daughter is currently weeping on a Persian rug down the hall. She's convinced you intend to eat her." Damien set his glass down on the side table with a soft clink. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His scent washed over me, cedar, dark leather, and something dangerous and metallic. "The contract specified Serena," he noted, his dark, unreadable eyes searching my face for the flicker of disgust he was accustomed to seeing. "Your father offered her as the primary collateral for his $20 million insolvency. Why are you standing here?" "Because Serena is a liability," I said, my tone as cold as a bank vault. "If you take her, she will scream. She will scheme. She will give you migraines and eventually find a way to make herself the victim of a high-profile kidnapping. She has no value beyond her social standing, which, as of this morning's market open, is rapidly depreciating." I took a step closer, entering his personal space. The guards shifted, the leather of their holsters creaking. Damien raised a hand, a silent command for them to stand down. "And you," he murmured. "What is your asset valuation, Elena?" "I am a forensic accountant by training and a strategist by nature," I said, looking directly into his ruined eye. "I know every offshore account my father has hidden. I know the legal loopholes in the Sterling trust Julian is currently bleeding dry. I am not just a body to occupy a room in your estate. I am the woman who can turn your $20 million bad debt into a strategic acquisition." Damien stood up. He towered over me, standing at least 6'4". He stepped so close I could feel the heat radiating from his chest. "You're talking about a debt restructuring," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "But I didn't come here for a business proposal. I came here to break a family that thought they could swindle me. I want a hostage, Elena. I want something to hold over your father's head until I decide to crush it." "Then take me," I replied. "Unconditionally. I will not run. I will not beg. But in exchange, I want a seat at the table. I want the resources to ensure that when the Vance family finally falls, I am the one holding the debris." Silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. I could see the pulse jumping in his neck, just above the line of the scar tissue. He was a predator who had encountered a puzzle he hadn't prepared for. Slowly, he raised his left hand, the scarred one. His calloused fingers hovered inches from my face. I didn't pull back. I didn't blink. I stepped into his touch. I reached up and placed my palm flat against his scarred cheek. The room went deathly silent. I heard the sharp clack-clack of the guards cocking their weapons. Damien went completely rigid, his breath catching in a ragged hitch. The scar tissue was thick, rough, and unusually warm under my fingertips. I stroked my thumb gently across his cheekbone, maintaining eye contact. "People look at me and they see a monster," he rasped, his eyes dilating until the dark pupils swallowed the irises. "They see the scars and they run. Monsters hide under beds, Damien, I whispered, my voice a soothing blade. I prefer my demons where I can see them. Take me away from here. I have nowhere else to go. He stared at me for a long, breathless moment. A dark, possessive spark ignited in his eyes, a look I recognized from the shadows of my past life, but this time, it was directed at a woman he didn't yet understand. He dropped his hand and turned his back to me, adjusting his suit jacket with a sudden, sharp motion. Harrison, he barked at the guard by the door. Get her coat. We leave in 5 minutes. He looked back over his shoulder, his face a mask of terrifying intent. And Elena? If I find out you're playing a game with me, if there is a single lie in your ledger, I won't just ruin you. I will burn your world to the ground and make you watch. I've already burned once, Damien, I said, a bitter, ghost-like smile touching my lips. Let's see who survives the fire this time. The ride to the Sinclair estate was completed in an absolute, suffocating silence. I sat in the back of the Maybach, watching the rain-slicked streets of Manhattan blur past the tinted windows. Damien sat beside me, a fortress of tension. I sat upright, my back perfectly straight, my hands folded calmly in my lap. I didn't fidget. I didn't weep. I watched the city lights reflect off the wet pavement and plotted. In my first life, I had spent this entire car ride curled into a fetal position, begging him to let me go. I had annoyed him so deeply that by the time we arrived, he had ordered his men to lock me in the furthest guest wing. This time, I felt his eyes on me. I could feel the weight of his stare, stripping me down to my soul. The car slowed as we approached the iron gates of a sprawling Gothic mansion perched on the cliffs overlooking the ocean. This was his kingdom. His cage. Damien leaned in, his face mere inches from mine as the car came to a halt. You're very calm for a woman who just sold herself into slavery, he rumbled. Collateral, I corrected him. Not slavery. And I'm calm because I know the value of the asset I've just placed on your balance sheet. The question is, Mr. Sinclair, do you have the courage to use it? Damien's jaw twitched. He reached out, his thumb brushing against my lower lip with a pressure that was almost painful. We'll see, Elena. We'll see. The door opened. The freezing Atlantic rain bit into my skin. The game had officially moved to the second stage, and the monster was finally interested. As I stepped into the dark foyer of the Sinclair estate, I didn't look back at the city lights. I knew that by tomorrow morning, Serena and Julian would be celebrating my disappearance with champagne. They thought they had discarded me into the jaws of a beast. What they didn't know was that I had just handed the beast the map to their front door, and I was the one leading the hunt. The morning sun didn't rise over the Sinclair estate, it bled through the heavy charcoal velvet curtains, casting long, bruised shadows across the master suite. I awoke not to the smell of ash and the roar of a furnace, but to the sharp, clinical scent of double-shot espresso and the low, rhythmic crackle of a hearth. I didn't move. I lay perfectly still under the black silk sheets, letting my heartbeat find a flat, steady cadence. In my previous life, waking up in this house had been a daily descent into madness. I had spent my mornings locked in a dusty guest room at the far end of the West Wing, sobbing until my capillaries burst and my eyes swelled shut. Not today. Today, I was in the master suite, Damien's private sanctuary. I turned my head. Damien Sinclair was sitting in a winged armchair across the room, fully dressed in a tailored navy three-piece suit. A tablet rested in his scarred hand, and a thin bone china cup sat on the table beside him. He wasn't reading. He was watching me sleep. His unscarred profile was caught in the morning light, sharp enough to cut, while the ruined side remained in the shadows. You didn't move once, he noted. His voice was a low, gravelly hum that seemed to vibrate through the mattress. Most people who find themselves in my custody toss and turn. They have nightmares. They beg for exits in their sleep. You slept like the dead. I find that a clear conscience is the best sleep aid, Damien, I replied. I sat up, the silk sheets sliding down my skin with a soft, expensive hiss. I didn't reach for a robe to cover myself. I didn't hide. I wanted him to see the lack of fear. It was the only currency he respected. And nightmares are for those who are afraid of the future. I've already seen mine. It's the past that should be worried. I stood up and walked toward the espresso machine on the sideboard. The floor was cold, Italian marble that felt like ice against the arches of my feet. I focused on the micro-movements, the haptic click of the capsule loading, the hiss of pressurized steam, the dark, viscous liquid swirling into the cup. I didn't look at him, but I felt his gaze tracking the line of my spine. "Your father called 4 times last night," Damien said, his tone conversational yet lethal. He was checking if the collateral was intact. He was checking if the check had cleared, I corrected, taking a sip of the bitter espresso. It scorched my tongue, a welcome sting. My father hasn't had a fiduciary duty toward me since I turned 18. To him, I'm a line item he finally managed to move to the settled column. A sharp knock echoed at the heavy oak door. Mrs. Gable, the austere housekeeper who had treated me like a leper in my first life, entered carrying a silver tray with a cordless telephone. Her eyes widened a fraction of an inch seeing me in the master suite, her face a mask of rigid shock. "Mr. Sinclair," she said, her voice tight. "There is a call for Miss Elena. A Serena Vance. She claims it is an emergency." A dark amusement curled in my stomach. Right on schedule. In the original timeline, Serena had waited 3 days to call. She'd sobbed, told me how Julian was working tirelessly to buy me back, all while they were busy liquidating my hidden savings accounts. "Put it on speaker, Mrs. Gable," I instructed. The housekeeper glanced at Damien. He gave a microscopic nod. I set my coffee down and stood by the hearth as the line clicked open. "Elena? Oh my God, Elena. Are you there? Are you alive?" Serena's voice crackled through the speaker, breathless and strained with artificial panic. It was a masterpiece of manipulative theater. "We haven't slept a wink, Elena. Father is a wreck. We thought that monster might have chopped you into pieces by now." Damien's jaw tightened. The scarred left side of his face seemed to pull, making his ruined eye look feral. I met his gaze, my expression a flat, unreadable mask. "I am perfectly intact, Serena," I said, my voice dripping with an icy, clinical detachment. "The accommodations are quite luxurious. Why are you calling? Unless you have the 20 million in hand, this conversation is an inefficiency." There was a fraction of a second of dead air. The question threw her. She had expected weeping. She had expected me to beg Julian to save me. "Elena, you sound strange. Did he drug you?" Serena's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "Listen, Julian is talking to his grandfather's lawyers. They're looking for a loophole in the contract. Just hold on, okay? We're going to get you out of that cage." "Julian is looking for a loophole?" I let out a short, sharp laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "Tell Julian to focus on his own forensic audit. Archibald Sterling doesn't like it when his grandsons treat the family trust like a personal Venmo. And Serena? Don't call this number again. I am not a victim to be rescued. I am a transaction to be settled. If you want to help, start selling your Birkins. You're going to need the cash. How can you be so cold?" Serena screeched, the fake tears evaporating instantly, replaced by a shrill, defensive edge. "We're trying to help you, and you're acting like a cold-hearted bitch." "I learned from the best," I said, and pressed the end call button. The silence that followed was heavy, pressurized. Damien stood up slowly, his massive frame blocking out the morning light. He walked toward me, stopping inches away. The scent of him, dark leather and cedar, wrapped around me like a shroud. "You just cut your only lifeline," he rumbled. "Why?" "Because it wasn't a lifeline, Damien. It was a noose," I said, looking up into his dark eyes. "My family is a sinking ship, and they were planning to use my captivity as a narrative to garner sympathy from the Sterling Foundation. They wanted to turn my misery into a capital raise." I walked over to his desk and picked up a thick leather-bound ledger, his shipping company's legitimate records. I flipped it open to a page I had memorized from my research. "I spent last night looking at your public filings," I said, my finger tracing a line of figures. "You have a $50 million leak in your Red Hook logistics branch. It's being masked as equipment depreciation, but the math doesn't track. You don't need a hostage, Damien. You need a forensic audit of your own house." "And Julian Sterling?" "He's the one who's been facilitating the shell company transfers for your head of security." Damien went stone still. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He reached out, his long, calloused fingers gripping my chin, forcing me to maintain eye contact. "You're claiming Harrison is stealing from me," he whispered, a lethal vibration in his chest. "I'm claiming Harrison is Julian Sterling's pension plan," I replied. "And if you give me access to your private server, I can prove it by market close." Damien stared at me, his thumb brushing against my lower lip. The dark, possessive spark in his eyes was no longer just about a hostage. It was the look of a man who had found a weapon he didn't know existed. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a sleek black titanium card. He held it out between his index and middle fingers. "My head of security is outside," Damien said softly. "Take him. Go into the city. Buy whatever you need to look the part of a Sinclair asset." "But Elena? If you're lying to me about the math, there is no prison on Earth that will keep you safe from me." "I don't need a prison, Damien," I said, taking the card. Our fingers brushed, a jolt of heat against the morning chill. "I just need the leverage. By tonight, your family won't be the only one with a debt problem." As I walked out of the master suite, the black titanium card felt heavy in my palm, a key to a vault Julian and Serena didn't even know I had entered. Harrison was waiting by the elevator, his face a mask of professional loyalty, oblivious to the fact that I already had the encrypted logs of his offshore accounts. The hunt hadn't just moved to the city, the massacre was about to begin on the floor of the stock exchange. The air in Manhattan smelled of rain-washed asphalt, expensive exhaust, and the frantic, metallic scent of a million people chasing a capital gain. As the armored Maybach glided down Fifth Avenue, I sat in the rear, my eyes fixed on the back of Harrison's head. He sat in the passenger seat, his neck a rigid column of muscle, his military-grade earpiece a glint of silver against his buzz-cut hair. I watched him through the rearview mirror, the man who would sell Damien Sinclair's life for a $2 million wire transfer. I felt no anger. Anger was a metabolic waste. Instead, I felt a precise, clinical curiosity. I was a surgeon looking at a tumor that didn't yet know it was about to be excised. "Mr. Sinclair's instructions were for you to acquire whatever you deem necessary for the Sterling Foundation Gala, Miss Elena," Harrison said, his voice a practiced, soulless monotone. "We have a private appointment at Bergdorf's in 10 minutes. "Thank you, Harrison," I replied. I reached into my clutch and pulled out the black titanium card. It felt heavier than plastic, cold and unapologetic. I ran my thumb over the embossed name, Sinclair. It wasn't just a credit instrument, it was a high-caliber round chambered in a rifle Julian Sterling didn't know was pointed at his heart. The boutique was a temple of minimalist luxury, white marble, brushed gold, and the hushed, reverent tones of sales associates who treated silk like holy relics. I was led to a private suite in the back, a room of cream velvet and floor-to-ceiling mirrors that reflected my pale, unreadable face back at me from a dozen different angles. "I'll need a moment," I told the lead stylist, a woman whose smile was as sharp and synthetic as a porcelain veneer. "And a glass of Sancerre." Chilled. Once the heavy doors clicked shut, I didn't look at the racks of Chanel and Dior. Harrison was waiting by the elevators. He noticed the shattered phone in my hand as I handed him the bag. "Is there a problem, Miss Elena?" he asked, his eyes narrow and suspicious. "The phone was defective," I said, stepping into the elevator. I looked at him, really looked at him, and for a second, I let the clinical coldness show in my eyes. I find that when something is no longer functional, it's best to destroy it completely. "Don't you agree, Harrison?" Harrison didn't blink, but I saw the slight tightening of his jaw, the way his hand twitched toward his earpiece. He knew I was a threat now. He just didn't know how deep the blade was already buried. We reached the car. As the door opened, the smell of the city hit me again, the scent of impending rain. I sat in the back, the Sinclair card tucked safely into my clutch. I pulled out my tablet and logged back into the Sinclair logistics branch. I saw Harrison's name on a side ledger, a series of $50,000 transfers masked as security consulting fees. I highlighted them. I didn't delete them. I just moved them into a folder labeled Evidence for Deposition. Harrison, I said as the car pulled into the stream of traffic. Yes, Miss Elena. Tell Damien I'll be ready for dinner at 8. And tell him I've finished the preliminary audit. The leak in his logistics branch wasn't a leak. It was a planned siphoning. I watched the back of his head. I saw the way his shoulders went stone rigid. I saw the knuckles of his hand go white as he gripped the steering wheel. I'll pass that along, miss, he rasped. I leaned back and closed my eyes. The first strike was over. The Vance family's credit was gone. The Sterling Trust was under investigation. And the traitor in Damien's house was now trapped in a car with his executioner. It was going to be a very long drive back to the estate. As the Maybach sped across the Brooklyn Bridge, I watched the Manhattan skyline through the tinted glass. To the world, those lights represented power. To me, they were just targets on a map. Serena and Julian were likely screaming at bank tellers right now, oblivious to the fact that the monster they feared wasn't the man with the scars, it was the sister they thought they had burned to ash. The fire was coming for them, and this time, I was the one holding the match. The diamond collar sitting against my throat weighed exactly 400 grams, yet it felt heavier than an iron shackle. It was a masterpiece of Sinclair starlight, crushed ice and liquid fire that pulsed with every beat of my carotid artery. I stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror in the Sinclair dressing room, watching my reflection. The midnight blue silk gown clung to my curves like a second, more dangerous skin. I looked less like a guest and more like a high-caliber weapon draped in velvet. The door clicked open behind me. I didn't turn. In the mirror's reflection, Damien Sinclair stepped into the light. He wore a bespoke black tuxedo that fit his massive frame with predatory precision. His hair was slicked back, exposing the full, unapologetic landscape of his scars. He looked like a fallen god who had crawled out of an inferno and decided to buy the world. He stopped inches behind me. I could feel the radiant heat from his body, the scent of cedarwood and dark bourbon wrapping around my shoulders. His large, calloused hands rose, resting lightly on my bare skin. The contrast was startling, the pale, flawless silk of my shoulders against the dark, powerful ink on his forearms. The elite of this city trade in shadows, Elena, he murmured, his voice a gravelly vibration against my ear. But tonight, you are the light they won't be able to look at directly. Are you ready to dismantle your past? I've been ready since the day I breathed in the ash of my own murder, Damien, I replied. I leaned back slightly into his solid warmth. Tonight isn't a debut. It's a foreclosure. The ride to the Sterling Foundation's grand ballroom was swift, a silent transit through the rain-slicked arteries of the Upper East Side. When the Maybach pulled onto the red carpet, the noise of the city was replaced by the frantic, mechanical clicking of paparazzi shutters. Damien stepped out first. The crowd visibly recoiled, a ripple of nervous whispers sweeping through the socialites like a cold front. Then, he reached his hand back into the car. I placed my palm in his, letting him pull me into the blinding white light of the flashes. The collective gasp was audible. They knew me. They knew Elena Vance, the quiet, mousy elder sister who stayed in the shadows while Serena shined. But the woman standing beside the most dangerous man in Manhattan, dripping in Sinclair diamonds and radiating a chilling, untouchable confidence, was a stranger to them. Don't blink, I whispered to myself, my pulse remaining flat and rhythmic. Let them see the price of their betrayal. We descended the grand staircase of the ballroom. The space was a sea of glittering gowns and tailored suits, a sanctuary for the city's social capital. As we moved, the crowd parted like the Red Sea. I scanned the room, my eyes sweeping past the politicians and the tycoons until I found them near the champagne fountain. My father, Robert, looked like he had aged a decade in 48 hours. Beside him, Serena was wearing a pale pink gown that made her look like a sugared almond. She was clinging to Julian Sterling's arm, her knuckles white. Julian was puffing out his chest, trying to maintain a facade of bravado that was rapidly crumbling. When Serena's eyes locked onto mine, her champagne flute slipped from her fingers. It shattered on the marble floor with a sharp, musical crack that seemed to silence the string quartet. I offered her a brilliant, terrifying smile. "Good evening, Father." "Serena." "Julian," I said, my voice carrying clearly over the hushed room. "I must say, the gala is lovely this year, though the company is a bit predictable." Julian stepped forward, his face flushed with a mix of rage and fear. He looked at Damien, then back at me, his eyes darting to the diamond collar at my neck. "Elena? What the hell is the meaning of this?" Julian hissed, his voice low and strained. "You're with him? Have you lost your mind? You're a hostage, for God's sake." "Hostage?" I laughed, a cold, melodic sound that lacked any trace of humor. I leaned into Damien's side, letting my hand rest flat against his broad chest. "Julian, darling, don't project your own insecurities onto me. Damien and I have a mutually beneficial arrangement. One that doesn't involve embezzlement or bankrupting a family trust to pay for a wedding you can no longer afford." The color drained from Julian's face, leaving him a sickly shade of gray. Serena gasped, her hand flying to her throat, where my mother's locket was conspicuously missing. "You don't know what you're talking about," Julian stammered. "I have a fiduciary duty to this foundation, a duty you breached the moment you opened that Apex Holdings account in the Caymans," I interrupted, my tone as clinical as a death sentence. I stepped closer to him, my heels clicking on the marble. I picked up a fresh glass of Bollinger from a passing waiter's tray. "Archibald is looking for you, by the way. He's in the library with a team of forensic accountants. It seems his golden heir has been lead all along." I watched Julian's pupils dilate. I saw the sweat begin to bead on his upper lip. He was a man watching his life's work dissolve in a glass of champagne. "You bitch," he whispered, his voice shaking with a lethal edge. I didn't answer with words. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the champagne, letting the bubbles sting my tongue. Then, as if by accident, I tilted my hand. The pale amber liquid poured out of the glass in a slow, viscous stream. It hit Julian's bespoke silk lapel, soaking into the fabric, dripping down onto his polished shoes. The room went deathly silent. It was a public, silent humiliation, an asset liquidation of his dignity in front of the very people he sought to impress. Julian stared down at the stain, his jaw working, his hands trembling at his sides. He looked like he wanted to strike me, but one glance at the scarred titan standing behind me kept him pinned to the floor. "You missed," I noted, my voice a soothing, lethal whisper. "Just like you missed the fact that I'm the only one who knows where the rest of the money is hidden." I handed the empty glass to a stunned Serena. "Hold that for me, Serena. You're going to need something to do when the FBI arrives." I turned my back on them, dismissing them entirely, and looked up at Damien. His eyes were blazing with a dark, triumphant fire. He wrapped a heavy arm around my waist, pulling me flush against him, his touch a possessive, territorial claim. "I'm thirsty, darling," I said. "Shall we find something better than this swill?" "Whatever you want, Elena," Damien rumbled, his voice echoing with a predatory satisfaction. As we walked away, leaving my family in a puddle of shattered glass and ruined plans, I felt the clinical coldness in my chest settle into a dark, pulsing peace. The trap was set. They were desperate now. And desperate people always make fatal mistakes. The fire was coming, and for the first time, I wasn't the one who was going to burn. As we glided toward the terrace, I caught a glimpse of Julian frantically checking his phone, no doubt seeing the final, account frozen, notification I had triggered before entering the hall. He looked toward the exit, but Harrison was already standing there, a dark shadow blocking his path. The gala wasn't over, but for Julian Sterling, the lights were already going out. The real slaughter was about to happen in the dark. The transition from the sweltering heat of the ballroom to the obsidian chill of the terrace was a physical shock. The air out here tasted of salt and incoming rain, a sharp contrast to the cloying scent of lilies and expensive sweat inside. I stood by the stone balustrade, the Sinclair diamonds cold against my skin. Damien stood beside me, a dark silhouette against the glittering Manhattan skyline. He wasn't looking at the view. He was watching the reflection in the glass doors behind us. "You're vibrating," Damien noted, his voice a low, gravelly hum that seemed to sync with the distant roar of the city. "It's the adrenaline, Damien," I replied, my fingers tracing the cold condensation on my champagne flute. "The chemical surge before the strike. My father and Julian are cornered rats now. And cornered rats don't hide, they bite." I turned my head slightly, my eyes scanning the perimeter with clinical precision. I wasn't looking for friends. I was looking for anomalies. That's when I saw him. Harrison. Damien's head of security was standing near the service entrance, his military-grade frame a rigid shadow. He wasn't watching the exits. He was watching his watch. Every 30 seconds, his eyes darted to the dial, his thumb hovering near the PTT button on his lapel. A security breach doesn't always look like a forced door. Sometimes, it's just a man standing 3 inches too far to the left. "Damien," I whispered, keeping my smile perfectly fixed as an elderly socialite waved at us from across the terrace. I leaned into his chest, my lips brushing his ear. "Harrison is compromised. He's been checking his watch every 30 seconds since we stepped outside. He's avoiding your eye line. He's not waiting for an arrival, he's waiting for a signal." I felt Damien's entire body go stone rigid. The tendons in his neck tightened like steel cables under his tuxedo collar. To any observer, we were a couple sharing an intimate moment. In reality, he was a predator calculating the trajectory of a threat. "Are you sure?" he murmured, raising a glass of bourbon to his lips. "The math of his movements doesn't track, Damien. He's out of sync with the defensive rotation. Julian and Serena were too confident earlier. They think they're about to be rid of you. Which means they think they're about to be rid of me." Suddenly, the grand chandelier inside the ballroom flickered. Once. Twice. Then the world plunged into an absolute, suffocating darkness. The screams from inside were instantaneous, a jagged, chaotic sound that tore through the night. The music died in a discordant screech of strings. I didn't move. I didn't scream. I had already died in the dark once. The shadows held no power over me anymore. A heavy hand clamped onto my wrist, yanking me hard against a solid chest. "Damien." He moved with a terrifying, fluid speed, dragging me behind a thick marble pillar just as a sharp thip-thip of suppressed gunfire shattered the glass doors we had been standing in front of seconds ago. I watched the shards of glass fall in slow motion, crystalline diamonds raining down onto the stone floor. The ballistics were clear. The shooter was on the adjacent rooftop, aiming for the heat signature of the terrace. "Stay low," Damien breathed against my ear. He didn't draw a gun. He became the shadow itself. I peered around the edge of the marble pillar, my pupils dilating to pull in the faint moonlight. 2 figures in dark tactical gear rushed through the terrace doors, their night vision goggles glowing a faint, toxic green. They were sweeping the area where we had been. One of them turned toward the pillar. He raised his weapon. I didn't think. My body moved with a clinical, detached efficiency. I reached down, my fingers closing around the handle of a heavy, solid silver ice bucket on the nearby catering table. It was filled with 8 pounds of melting ice and a bottle of unopened Krug. I swung it with everything I had. The arc was perfect. The silver bucket caught the first assassin squarely in the side of his tactical helmet. The sound was a dull, sickening thud crack. He staggered, his suppressed weapon firing a stray round that sparked off the marble floor inches from my feet. That second of distraction was all Damien needed. He emerged from the darkness like a leviathan rising from the depths. He grabbed the assassin's wrist, snapping the bone with a sound like a dry branch. In the same motion, he drove a silver karambit blade, hidden in his sleeve, into the man's throat. A dark, viscous spray hit the white marble. The second assassin spun around, but Damien was already there. He didn't use the knife. He used his bare hands, a brutal, efficient display of violence that left the man crumpled on the floor in a heap of broken ribs and ruined aspirations. Suddenly, the backup generators kicked in. The emergency lights flooded the terrace in a harsh, sickly yellow glare. Damien stood in the center of the carnage, his tuxedo stained with blood, his chest heaving. He looked like the devil incarnate. The elite guests inside were still screaming, scrambling for the exits, but Damien wasn't looking at them. His wild, feral eyes locked onto mine. I was still standing by the pillar, my midnight blue silk dress torn at the hem, my chest rising and falling in time with the adrenaline-fueled thrum of my pulse. I wasn't shaking. My hands were perfectly steady. He stalked toward me, dropping the bloody knife on the floor with a metallic clatter. He ignored the chaos, ignored his remaining loyal guards rushing onto the terrace. He grabbed my shoulders, his large hands gripping me so tightly I knew they would leave bruises. "You threw an ice bucket at an armed killer," he rasped, his voice shaking with a terrifying mix of adrenaline and something far more possessive. "He was going to shoot you, Damien," I replied evenly, looking up into his dark, dilated eyes. "And as I told you before, I protect my investments." A ragged, primal sound tore from his throat. He crushed his mouth down onto mine. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a collision. It tasted of copper, smoke, and absolute, devastating possession. His hand tangled in my hair, pulling my head back, anchoring me to him as if I were the only solid thing in a collapsing universe. I kissed him back, pouring all my rage, my survival, and my dark triumph into him. When he finally pulled away, we were both breathless. He rested his forehead against mine, his breath warm against my skin. "Harrison," Damien growled, his eyes burning into mine. "He's gone, Damien," I whispered, my hands resting on his blood-stained tuxedo. "But he's not the one who signed the check. Julian and Serena, they tried to take you from me so they could have everything. They've just turned a conflict of interest into a death warrant." Damien stepped back. The look on his scarred face would haunt the nightmares of the Manhattan elite for decades. The monster wasn't just awake. He was off his leash. "No one touches what is mine," Damien Sinclair vowed, his voice echoing over the ruined terrace. "I will burn their entire world to the ground. And I will make them watch." I smiled, the cold, dead girl inside me finally feeling a dark, radiating warmth. "Then let's go buy some gasoline, Damien. The massacre is only just beginning." As the sirens began to wail in the distance, I saw Julian and Serena being ushered out of the ballroom by the police, for their own safety. Julian looked back, his eyes searching the darkness for a sign that Damien was dead. Instead, he found me. I raised my hand, the Sinclair diamonds catching the emergency lights, and blew him a kiss. The terror that crossed his face was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. The hunt was no longer in the shadows, the war was now public. The air in the subterranean holding cell of the Sinclair estate smelled of damp concrete, ozone from the high-voltage security grid, and the sharp, copper tang of Harrison's fear. It was a clinical, windowless environment, a stark contrast to the velvet-lined opulence of the Obsidian Gala. Here, the world was reduced to cold surfaces and hard truths. Harrison sat strapped to a bolted-down steel chair under the flickering glare of a single halogen bulb. The light buzzed with a low, irritating frequency that seemed to vibrate inside my skull. His military-grade tuxedo was torn at the shoulder, stained with a dark splash of his own blood where Damien's enforcers had subdued him. His breathing was shallow, a rhythmic, wet wheeze that echoed off the gray cinder-block walls. Damien stood in the shadows, his tuxedo jacket discarded, his white dress shirt rolled up to his elbows. The ink on his forearms looked blacker in this light, the scarred tissue of his face twisted into a mask of terrifying, silent focus. He didn't have to touch Harrison. His presence alone was a weight that made the traitor's chest hitch. I stepped into the light, my midnight blue gown a jarring splash of luxury in this tomb. I held a thick manila folder in my hand, the physical manifestation of Julian Sterling's ruin. You've been with Damien for 6 years, Harrison, I said, my voice flat and precise. I walked in a slow circle around him, my heels clicking like a metronome on the concrete. He paid for your mother's hospice care. He bought your loyalty at a premium. And yet, you sold his itinerary to a Russian hit squad for a $2 million wire transfer. The math of your betrayal is remarkably poor. Harrison looked up, his eyes bloodshot and darting. Mr. Sinclair. I had to. Julian, he has evidence of the missing shipments from the Red Hook docks. He was going to go to the feds. I was trapped. Julian Sterling couldn't find his way out of a paper bag without a trust fund, Harrison, I said, stopping directly in front of him. I opened the folder. He didn't blackmail you. He offered you an exit strategy. You received a wire fraud notification in an offshore account registered to Apex Holdings 48 hours ago. It was a sloppy transfer, routed through a Sterling-owned shell company in the Caymans. Did you really think I wouldn't find the breadcrumbs? I pulled out a series of bank statements and spread them on the small metal table in front of him. I watched his eyes track the numbers, the dates, the amounts, the routing codes. I saw the moment his hope died. It was a physical collapse of his posture, a slight sagging of his shoulders. Julian and Serena think this was a play for power, I continued, my tone dropping to a lethal whisper. They think that by killing Damien, they can inherit the Sinclair influence and wipe their own debts. But they've made a fatal error in their forensic audit. They've engaged in wire fraud across state lines. This isn't just a hit, Harrison. This is a federal racketeering case. Damien stepped out of the shadows, his hand resting on the back of Harrison's chair. I felt the air in the room thicken. I don't care about the money, Harrison, Damien rumbled, his voice a low, predatory vibration. I care about the precedent. You brought a hit squad into a room where Elena was standing. You turned my house into a target. For that, I should let my men take their time with you. Wait, I said, raising a hand. I looked at Damien, then back at Harrison. Death is too clean. Julian and Serena want a martyr. If Harrison disappears, they'll play the victims of a mob war. No. I want something far more permanent. I pulled a heavy Mont Blanc fountain pen from the folder. The nib glinted under the halogen bulb. I placed a single sheet of paper over the bank statements, a full, detailed confession. This is a formal deposition, I said to Harrison. In it, you will detail every meeting with Julian Sterling. You will provide the encryption keys for the Apex Holdings accounts. You will name the Russian intermediaries. In exchange, I will ensure this file reaches the FBI's racketeering division by sunrise. Harrison stared at the pen. The feds? If I sign that, I'm going to prison for 20 years. If you don't sign it, you won't live to see the next 20 minutes, I countered, leaning in until I could see the sweat beading on his upper lip. But if you do sign, Julian and Serena will be hit with a RICO Act indictment. Their assets will be seized. Their names will be scrubbed from every board in Manhattan. They won't just be poor, they'll be radioactive. You get to live in a federal cell. They get to rot in a cage of their own making. Harrison's hand trembled as he reached for the pen. I watched the micro-movements of his fingers, the way his knuckles went white, the way his breath caught in his throat. He looked at Damien, seeking a reprieve he knew wouldn't come. Damien simply stared back with his ruined eye, a silent executioner. The nib touched the paper. I watched the black ink bleed into the parchment, forming the letters of his name. Asterisk scratch. Scratch. Scratch, asterisk. The sound was small, yet it sounded like a building collapsing. One stroke at a time, Harrison was dismantling the Sterling dynasty. When he finished, I pulled the paper away, blowing on the ink to dry it. The scent of the fresh ink was intoxicating, the smell of a successful audit. Thank you, Harrison, I said. I tucked the paper back into the manila folder. Mrs. Gable will bring you some water. Don't bother trying to pray. God doesn't take depositions. I turned on my heel and walked out of the cell. Damien followed me, the heavy steel door slamming shut with a concussive boom that echoed through the subterranean corridor. We walked in silence until we reached the elevator. Once inside, Damien turned to me. He grabbed my waist, pulling me flush against him. His eyes were dark, searching my face with an intense, fascinated hunger. "You're more dangerous than I thought, Elena," he murmured. "You didn't just break him. You turned him into a weapon against your own blood." "They stopped being my blood the moment they dropped that match in the warehouse, Damien," I replied, my hands resting on his broad chest. "Julian and Serena think they are playing a game of chess. They don't realize I've already audited the board and found them bankrupt." Damien leaned down, his forehead resting against mine. "The RICO Act takes time, Elena. Grand juries, indictments, it could take months." "I don't have months, Damien," I whispered, my fingers curling into his shirt. "I have the Sterling Trust's final audit in 48 hours. By the time the FBI knocks on Julian's door, I want him to be standing in the middle of a wasteland. I don't want them just arrested. I want them erased." Damien smiled, a dark, terrifying curve of his lips. "Whatever you need, Elena. The Sinclair resources are your scalpel." The elevator doors opened to the main hall. The morning light was beginning to touch the horizon, a pale, cold gold. The trap was set. The confession was signed. The only thing left was to pull the trigger on the Sterling Foundation's credit rating. As Damien led me back to the master suite, I looked at the manila folder in my hand. Inside was the death warrant for Julian and Serena's social and financial existence. I could almost hear the ticking of the clock in the Sterling library, a countdown to the moment Archibald Sterling would realize his legacy was a lie. Julian thought he was the hunter, but as the sun rose over Manhattan, he was nothing more than a figure on a ledger, and I was about to move him to the deleted column. The glow of the triple monitor setup in Damien's study was a cold, neon blue that turned my skin the color of a ghost. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Manhattan skyline was beginning to wake, the skyscrapers of the financial district piercing a blanket of gray fog like a row of jagged glass teeth. I sat in the high-backed leather chair, the weight of the Sinclair conglomerate's private server humming beneath my fingertips. I didn't feel tired. Adrenaline is a powerful metabolic preservative. My focus was narrow, clinical, and centered entirely on the blinking cursor of my terminal. I was no longer a woman, I was an algorithm. "The Sterling Foundation's liquidity is concentrated in 3 primary domestic accounts," I said, my voice cutting through the silence of the room. Damien stood by the window, a glass of dark bourbon in his hand, his reflection ghosted against the city. "Julian has moved 40% of their liquid assets into the Apex Holdings shell to cover his personal margins. He's left the Foundation's primary charitable trust entirely exposed. He's not just a thief, he's an amateur." I reached for my crystal glass of ice water. The condensation was a thin, freezing film that made the glass slip slightly against my palm. I took a slow sip, the cold stinging my throat, a sharp reset for my senses. "Start the equity dilution," Damien rumbled, not turning from the window. "I want their share price so low that the janitors can buy the board seats." "It's already in motion, Damien," I replied. I began the sequence. My fingers danced over the mechanical keyboard, each click a sharp, satisfying report like a bone snapping. Asterisk clack. Clack. Clack clack, asterisk. I wasn't just selling, I was flooding the market with the Sterling family's dirty laundry. I initiated the hostile takeover protocol. Through a network of Sinclair-controlled entities, we began the rapid-fire acquisition of Sterling's distressed debt. Every time Julian tried to move funds to shore up his position, my script intercepted the transfer, flagging it for compliance review, based on the RICO evidence I'd uploaded to the SEC portal an hour ago. The micro-movements of the market were a chaotic symphony on the screen. The red bars of the Sterling stock ticker began to dive, a vertical drop that looked like a jagged red waterfall. Asterisk 84.50. 72.10. 55.30, asterisk. "Julian just realized the floor is gone," I noted, watching the real-time trade logs. "He's trying to call Archibald. He's desperate. He's going to beg for a bailout. Archibald won't answer, Damien said, finally turning to face me. The scarred side of his face was caught in the blue light, making the rigid tissue look like a landscape of frozen fire. I had the deposition delivered to his estate at 5 a.m. by a federal courier. The Sterling patriarch is currently realizing his legacy has been hollowed out by his favorite grandson. The phone on the desk buzzed. It was a private line, the Vance Manor. I let it vibrate against the mahogany for 5 full seconds, watching it skitter across the wood like a dying insect. Then, I picked it up and hit the speaker. Elena? Elena, pick up. My father's voice was a ragged, high-pitched mess of terror. I could hear the sound of heavy furniture being moved in the background, the sound of a foreclosure. The bank, they're here, Elena. They're seizing the accounts. They've frozen the manor's trust. They say the debt has been called in for immediate liquidation. Tell Sinclair to stop. Please. The debt was never Sinclair's to stop, Father, I said, my voice as flat as a dial tone. You used the Vance name as collateral for a life you couldn't afford. I'm simply the one executing the final audit. According to the Chapter 11 filing I just submitted on your behalf, the manor is no longer a residence. It's a distressed asset. You have 2 hours to vacate before the sheriff arrives. You heartless brat. I raised you. I gave you everything. You gave me to a monster to pay for your gambling debts, Father, I countered, my eyes fixed on the plunging stock ticker. The difference is, the monster turned out to have more honor than the man who sired me. Goodbye, Robert. I pressed that end button. My thumb lingered on the screen for a fraction of a second, the only sign of the pressure building in my chest. Now for the final blow, I whispered. I navigated to Julian's personal brokerage account. Because I still held the legacy administrative keys from our engagement, I had full visibility. I saw his final attempt to save himself, a desperate, illegal transfer of Sterling Foundation funds into his private margin account. I didn't stop him. I let the transfer complete. Then, I hit submit on the SEC whistleblower report. The enter key on my keyboard felt heavier than usual. I placed my index finger on it, feeling the haptic resistance, the slight spring of the mechanical switch. This was the moment. This was the match dropped into the warehouse. Click. The screen flashed a single, clinical confirmation, * file submitted. Case hashtag 8821 SEC *. Within seconds, the market data feed spiked. Trading on Sterling Foundation stock was halted. A regulatory freeze banner appeared across the screen in a stark, blinding yellow. Julian was no longer just a failed businessman, he was a federal fugitive. I leaned back in the chair, the blue light of the monitors reflecting in my pupils. I felt a clinical, freezing peace settle over me. The Vance name was gone. The Sterling Trust was a ruin. And Julian and Serena were currently standing in a house of cards that was being leveled by a hurricane. It's done, Damien, I said. Damien walked over to me, stopping behind the chair. He placed his massive, scarred hands on my shoulders, his grip firm and grounding. He leaned down, his breath warm against my ear, the scent of cedar and aged bourbon wrapping around me like a shield. You look like a goddess of the apocalypse, Elena, he murmured. I feel like a woman who finally has a clean ledger, I replied. I reached up, covering his hand with mine. The liquidity crisis will hit them by noon. By sunset, they won't have enough credit to buy a cup of coffee. They are officially bankrupt, spiritually, legally, and financially. But Julian is a cornered animal, Damien warned, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the frozen ticker. And an animal with nothing left to lose will always try to take someone with him. Let him try, I said, watching the sunrise finally break over the city, turning the skyscrapers into pillars of gold. I've been waiting 5 years to finish this audit. I'm not leaving until every cent of the debt is paid in blood. The ticker tape on the bottom of the news screen began to crawl with the breaking headline, Federal Investigation into Sterling Foundation. CEO Julian Sterling sought for questioning. I watched the words repeat, a digital mantra of my triumph. My phone buzzed one last time, a text from an unknown number. Pier 34. Midnight. I have the locket, I looked at Damien, and a dark, predatory smile touched my lips. The circle was almost closed. Midnight was coming, and this time, I was the one bringing the fire. Midnight at the Red Hook docks tasted of salt, old rust, and the impending metallic tang of rain. The wind howled off the Atlantic, a low-frequency moan that rattled the corrugated iron siding of the derelict warehouse at Pier 34. I stood at the threshold, my breath hitching for a fraction of a second as the scent of the interior hit me. It wasn't just dust and dampness anymore. It was the phantom smell of 91-octane gasoline. I reached up, my fingers brushing the small, cold transmitter taped securely beneath my collarbone. It was a masterpiece of audio forensics tech, sensitive enough to record a heartbeat in a hurricane. I adjusted the lapel of my black trench coat, feeling the clinical, freezing detachment settle in my chest. My pulse was a flat, rhythmic 65 beats per minute. I was no longer a victim, I was a wire. I'm going in, I whispered, the words barely a breath. I have you, Elena, Damien's voice crackled in my earpiece, a low, gravelly hum that acted as a grounding wire for my nerves. Snipers are in position. Don't let them move you to a blind spot. I pushed open the heavy iron side door. It groaned on its rusted hinges, a sound like a dying animal echoing through the cavernous, pitch-black space. High above, a single floodlight clicked on, illuminating the rusted iron catwalk suspended 30 feet in the air. There they were. Serena and Julian looked like ghosts of the people they had been 48 hours ago. Serena's blonde hair was a matted rat's nest, her eyes bloodshot and manic. Julian stood beside her, his bespoke suit rumpled and stained, clutching a heavy red jerry can with white-knuckled desperation. The smell of gasoline immediately hit the back of my throat, bringing a vivid, searing flash of the warehouse fire back to my retinas. I blinked it away. You actually came, Serena sneered, her voice cracking with a frantic, jagged energy. She leaned over the railing, looking down at me. I knew you were stupid, Elena, but I didn't think you were suicidal. Where is the locket, Serena? I asked, my voice carrying clearly through the empty room. I kept my hands visible by my sides, my posture perfectly vertical. I'm here. Now give me the only thing left of my mother. I pawned it 3 years ago to pay for Julian's first margin call, you fool. Serena laughed, a sharp, hysterical sound that echoed off the metal walls. She pulled a silver Zippo from her pocket, the same one Julian had used to kill me. She flipped the lid open with a metallic clink flick. I don't have your locket. I just wanted to see if you were still the same pathetic martyr who would die for a piece of jewelry. Julian hefted the jerry can, his face a mask of sweating, unadulterated terror. My grandfather cut me off because of you, Elena. The feds are at my door. We have nothing. But if you die tonight in an unfortunate accident caused by Sinclair's negligence, we can still win. We become the victims. We sue the estate. We take everything back. I watched them with a clinical, detached curiosity. They were cornered animals trying to execute a plan that was already bankrupt. They didn't realize that every word of this premeditated murder plot was currently being streamed directly to a federal server. You're going to burn me again? I asked, my voice a calm, lethal blade. In the same spot? It's a bit unoriginal, don't you think? Shut up. Serena shrieked, flicking the lighter. The small orange flame illuminated her deranged face. Julian, pour it. Douse the floor. Julian moved to tip the gasoline over the edge of the catwalk, aiming for the space around my feet. Pew. The sound was a soft, suppressed crack that seemed to come from the very air. I didn't flinch. I watched as a high-caliber round, a masterpiece of ballistics, shattered Julian's right kneecap with surgical precision. The heavy red jerrycan slipped from his hands, falling through the air in slow motion. It hit the concrete floor 10 feet away from me, the gasoline spilling out in a dark, harmless pool that didn't reach my heels. Julian collapsed onto the catwalk, a ragged, high-pitched scream tearing from his throat as he clutched his ruined leg. Serena froze, the lighter trembling in her hand. Her eyes widened, darting toward the high, clerestory windows where the muzzle flashes of the snipers were invisible in the dark. "Drop the lighter, Serena," I commanded. The heavy iron doors at the front of the warehouse didn't just open, they were violently blown off their hinges by a controlled breach charge. Boom, the pressure wave hit my back, a warm, concussive force. A flood of tactical flashlights cut through the darkness, their beams dancing like frantic white needles. Leading them was Damien Sinclair. He moved with the terrifying, fluid grace of an apex predator. He wore a heavy black overcoat, his scarred face looking like a carved marble demon in the harsh tactical lighting. He didn't look at the tactical team, his eyes were locked onto me. He pointed a matte black handgun directly at Serena's head. "Drop it," Damien growled. The words carried a concussive force of their own. "Or the next bullet goes through your skull." Serena's hand opened. The Zippo hit the iron grate of the catwalk with a hollow clatter, the flame extinguishing before it could touch the ground. She fell to her knees beside the sobbing, bleeding Julian, her hands raised in a gesture of absolute, pathetic surrender. "Mia. Elena, please." Serena sobbed, her fake tears finally turning into real, ugly salt. "You're my sister. Tell him to stop. We were just scared." I walked toward the catwalk, stopping beneath the floodlight. I looked up at her, at the woman who had watched me burn, at the sister who had traded my life for a pair of shoes. I felt no hate. I felt no joy. I just felt the cold, dark satisfaction of a settled ledger. "I don't have a sister, Serena," I said, my voice echoing through the ruined warehouse. "I have a $20 million bad debt that I've finally moved to the reclaimed column. You and Julian aren't going back to the Hamptons. You're going to a federal penitentiary where your fragile act won't get you a single minute of pity." Damien reached my side. He didn't say a word. He simply draped his heavy coat over my shoulders, pulling me back against his solid, warm chest. His arms wrapped around my waist, anchoring me. I leaned back into him, watching as the FBI agents swarmed the catwalk, dragging Serena and Julian into handcuffs. "Is it over?" Damien murmured against my hair. "The audit is complete, Damien," I replied, watching as they wheeled Julian out on a stretcher, his screams fading into the wind. "The fire is out. And this time, I'm the only one standing in the ashes." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the sapphire locket. I hadn't found it at the pawn shop, I had found it in Serena's jewelry box weeks ago when I sent Damien's men to clean out her closet. I held it up, the blue stone catching the tactical lights. "Let's go home, Damien," I said. "I'm ready to rule the city we just conquered." As we walked out onto the pier, the rain finally began to fall, a cold, cleansing deluge that washed the scent of gasoline from the air. Serena's screams were muffled by the slamming of the armored transport doors. I looked at the Manhattan skyline, a glittering crown of light across the water, and realized that for the first time in 2 lives, I could breathe. The debt was paid. The past was burned. And the future? The future belonged to the woman who had learned how to play with fire and win. The morning air at the top of Sinclair Tower was thin, cold, and tasted of ozone. From 70 floors up, Manhattan looked less like a city and more like a circuit board, a complex, pulsing grid of capital and consequence. I stood on the private terrace, the glass railing a transparent barrier between me and the 300-foot drop. I wore a tailored white wool suit, the fabric crisp and clinical, a stark contrast to the midnight blue silk of my past. I looked at my hands. They were perfectly still. No tremors, no phantom heat from the warehouse fire. The scars on my wrists from the zip ties had been erased by the finest plastic surgeons in Zurich, leaving behind a smooth, porcelain surface that felt entirely new. I was a rebuilt machine, fine-tuned for a world that no longer had a place for Julian or Serena. I turned back toward my office. The interior was a sanctuary of dark oak, brushed steel, and silent power. My desk was clear, save for a single, slim laptop and a glass of sparkling water. I sat down, the haptic click of the chair's leather as I leaned back providing a grounding, sensory report. I opened the laptop. The morning's mergers and acquisitions report was the first thing on the screen. Sinclair conglomerate completes hostile takeover of Bingham and Reed. I allowed myself a slow, shallow breath. Bingham and Reed was the very firm that had managed the Sterling Trust, the firm that Julian had used to mask his theft. Now, I sat on the board. I was the one who decided which accounts were liquidated and which legacies were allowed to survive. I pulled up the latest update on the Sterling RICO case. It was a clinical list of failures. Julian Sterling's appeal had been denied 48 hours ago. He was currently serving a 30-year sentence in a high-security federal facility for wire fraud and conspiracy to commit murder. The report mentioned he had been moved to the infirmary after an altercation in the yard. My pulse didn't quicken. I felt a flat, rhythmic detachment. He was no longer a person, he was a settled debt. Serena's mugshot appeared in a side link under associated indictments. Her blonde hair had been shorn to a jagged, uneven bob. The fragile socialite act hadn't survived the first week of her 15-year sentence. She looked hollowed out, a paper doll left in the rain. I clicked the close window button. The movement was small, a half-inch flick of my finger, but it felt like the final strike of a gavel. The office door opened with a heavy, pressurized hiss. I didn't have to look up to know it was Damien. The scent of him, cedar, dark leather, and the faint, metallic tang of his presence, filled the room before he reached my desk. He wore a charcoal suit, his hair slicked back, the scarred side of his face caught in the brilliant, unapologetic light of the morning sun. He looked powerful, untamed, and entirely mine. He didn't speak. He walked to the window, his massive frame blocking out the skyline. He stood there for a moment, his hands clasped behind his back, before he turned to look at me. His unscarred eye was dark, searching my face with that familiar, fascinated hunger. "The final audit is complete, then," he rumbled, his baritone voice vibrating through the mahogany of my desk. "Bingham and Reed is officially ours, Damien," I replied. I closed the laptop lid with a soft, decisive thud. The Sterling name has been scrubbed from the building. The Vance debt has been converted into equity in our new logistics branch. Every cent has been accounted for. "And your father?" "Robert is in a private, heavily monitored assisted living facility in Connecticut," I said, my voice as level as a horizon line. "He has a garden, 3 meals a day, and no access to a telephone or a deck of cards. He will live out his days in a state of comfortable, silent irrelevance." It was the most efficient way to handle the legacy issue. Damien walked toward me, stopping at the edge of my desk. He leaned down, resting his large, scarred hands on the polished wood. "You've spent a year dismantling the world that tried to burn you, Elena," he murmured, his gaze dilating. "The Sterling Trust is gone. The Vance Manor is a Sinclair asset. Your enemies are in cages. Tell me, is the fire finally out?" I stood up, stepping into his personal space. I reached up, my fingers tracing the line of his jaw, the skin of my palm brushing the rigid, warm tissue of his scar. I didn't recoil. I leaned into the touch, finding a dark, stabilizing peace in the ruin of his face. "The fire didn't go out, Damien," I whispered, my breath warm against his skin. "I just learned how to harness it. I spent my first life as a sacrifice. I've spent the last year as a predator. But now I'm ready to be something else." "And what is that?" "The queen of the empire we're going to build on their ashes," I said. Damien's jaw tightened, a muscle feathering in his unscarred cheek. He reached out, his thumb catching my lower lip, pulling it down just enough to see the predatory spark in my eyes. He didn't kiss me, not yet. He held me there, in that high-altitude silence, as if he were memorizing the coordinates of my soul. "They thought they could discard you," Damien rasped, his voice shaking with a terrifying mix of pride and possession. "They thought you were a liability they could write off. They had no idea they were handing me the most lethal trust in Manhattan. They underestimated the math of a woman with nothing left to lose, I replied. I reached back and picked up the sapphire locket from my desk, the only piece of the past I had allowed to survive. I didn't put it on. I placed it in the center of the desk, a small, blue eye staring up at the ceiling. Then, I turned my back on it. I walked toward the door, my heels clicking a rhythmic, triumphant cadence on the oak floorboards. Damien followed me, his hand resting on the small of my back, a territorial claim that felt like a shield. As we stepped into the private elevator, I caught our reflection in the polished chrome doors. We were a collision of light and shadow, a power couple forged in the furnace of betrayal and refined in the cold reality of the financial district. The doors closed with a silent, expensive hiss, plunging us into a brief, intimate darkness before the descent began. The city belonged to us. The debt was paid. The ledger was clean. And as the elevator plummeted toward the street level, I realized that for the first time in 2 lives, I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I was the one who owned the floor. I sat in the back of the Maybach as we glided through the heart of the city, the skyscrapers rising around us like a canyon of glass and steel. My phone buzzed, a notification from the Sinclair legal team. Julian Sterling's final asset liquidation complete. I swiped the notification away and looked out at the sunrise. The fire of the past was gone, replaced by the cold, brilliant light of the empire we had built. I wasn't just Elena Vance anymore. I was the woman who had walked through hell and come out holding the keys. The audit was over. The rain had begun.